You are listening to the voice of Thomas Avery. I was a journalist once. Washington Post, foreign desk. 5 tours in the Middle East, 2 in Venezuela, and 1 assignment embedded with Army engineers in Aleppo that never made print. The last paycheck I cashed was in 2027. After that, I started broadcasting from this little station east of Lexington, Kentucky. Just me, an old tower, a diesel generator with a sticky starter, and a modified shortwave rig that transmits on 7.850 megahertz. I built this place for emergencies. Turns out, the emergency came from inside the house. It's July now. Not that it matters. You've probably noticed there's no federal emergency broadcast system anymore. NOAA's weather stations still auto-ping, but nothing updates. The old EAS relay backbone? Gone offline in April, after the FCC's physical servers in Silver Spring were burned out. The last official message I captured was a repeat of a Level 3 National Contingency Directive, and even that was almost 2 months ago. Nothing since. What you're hearing now is not a government channel. I'm not sponsored. I'm not part of any militia. I'm just a man trying to keep the signal alive. Let me try to bring you up to speed. The first confirmed military mutiny was in January. It started with the 174th Infantry Brigade out of Fort Drum refusing orders to deploy to Chicago. That city had already been under federal emergency lockdown for 43 days, and supply lines were breaking down after the Illinois Guard refused to coordinate with FEMA. Tensions were high after the December fuel convoys were hijacked near Gary, Indiana. Then came the declaration from Governor Felder, Illinois, was temporarily withdrawing from federal oversight due to institutional collapse. That was the phrase everyone clung to. Institutional collapse. Of course, D.C. pushed back. The president issued a national unification order, labeling the Illinois withdrawal constitutionally invalid and authorizing Title X mobilization. That's when the real divide happened. Several governors, including Texas, Arizona, and Idaho, released simultaneous statements refusing to honor the mobilization, citing abuse of federal power. Then Mississippi went dark for 48 hours. When comms came back, their state capitol building had been occupied by private security groups under contract with something called the North River Coalition. I'd never even heard of that name before. It wasn't a company. It was something more. Fragmented, veteran-led, networked, and armed. At that point, the internet was still partially up domestic satellite uplinks and mesh intranet systems in urban centers helped, but federal sites started going blank. DOJ, ATF, even parts of DHS were being scrubbed or showing maintenance messages for weeks. In late February, FEMA's National Registry vanished from its primary domain. You could still access mirrors, but nothing updated. It was like watching the organs shut down in real time. By March, half of the East Coast was already split into sectors. Not officially, of course. But if you looked at the movement maps, the ones crowdsourced by former Air Force weather analysts, you could see it clearly. Washington, D.C. to Richmond was a semi-fortified corridor, controlled by what remained of the loyal executive branch. Beyond that, patchwork. Parts of Virginia, especially rural zones in the Blue Ridge region, formed their own civic militias. Not hostile, not crazy, just tired. They called themselves the Appalachian Civic Defense Network. Their radio traffic was organized, even disciplined. I've talked to a few of them over UHF. They monitor road traffic, avoid fights, and focus on maintaining trade routes with eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina. One of them told me they hadn't seen a federal convoy in 6 weeks, not even drone flyovers. Meanwhile, up north Boston, Providence, and most of New England declared a civil continuity zone with emergency cooperation among state-level departments. I actually admire what they tried to do. They used leftover emergency infrastructure from pandemic-era contingency plans and turned it into a working regional government. They kept public transport running until the diesel ran dry. Even kept hospitals open using local microgrid solar power, although that only held for a while. The real fracture came in April, when the Midwest freight grid broke apart. Once the Federal Reserve was officially declared non-functional during that catastrophic cyber breach, the one blamed on internal sabotage, everything from corn futures to diesel futures vanished from the indexes. Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas created their own interstate freight authority with fuel priority for agricultural corridors. That's when the term Free States Compact started appearing in independent radio chatter. That was never a federal term, but it caught on quick. The compact wasn't just an alliance, it became an identity. Every week since, I've seen more evidence of divergence. Road signage repainted, state trooper cars stripped of decals, checkpoints manned by Civil Watch, wearing surplus Army BDUs and Chinese-made body armor. Each region broadcasts its own protocols: medical clearance, water rationing, residency codes. No federal stamps, no blue seals, just local ink and loud voices. I don't think people understand just how fragile it all was, how paper-thin the illusion of continuity was. You know what's still working? The Amtrak Zephyr. Seriously. Volunteers in Colorado took over dispatching out of the Denver rail hub. They've been running stripped-down trains from Denver to Salt Lake twice a week. No tickets. Just cargo priority and seat rotation. I got a message last week from a woman named Liza Farrowist to be a rail technician. She said the route is guarded by a mix of retired conductors and volunteer watchmen who patrol the track with modified hunting rifles. No uniforms. Just duty. Meanwhile, the cities on the coast, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, they've become something else entirely. LA broke into districts. Gangs turned into local administrators. Water rights are auctioned. Manhattan is mostly evacuated. Staten Island declared independence with help from former Coast Guard cutters. Brooklyn is burning again. I'm not trying to scare you. I just want you to know that if you're out there, if you're afraid, you're not wrong to be. But you're not crazy either. They'll tell you it's temporary. They'll say there's still a chain of command, that emergency protocols are being followed. But here's the truth. The chain of command snapped back in January. The protocols are just muscle memory now. You are living through the death of the federal system. No bombs dropped. No plague. No alien invaders. Just political erosion, economic fracture, and a long string of bad decisions no one was brave enough to stop. Now, the signal you're hearing may cut in and out. I don't always get fuel. The generator hates cold starts. But I will keep talking until the antenna rusts through, or someone burns me out. If you're still alive, still listening, and you've got a voice, I want to hear from you. Send your story over shortwave. Relay it through nodes. Bounce it through the static. We may have lost the Republic, but we haven't lost memory. This is Thomas Avery. Stay safe, stay smart, and stay on the air. If you're just now picking up this signal, maybe you finally figured out how to wire an old Yaesu, or your car's HF band caught me during skip propagation. Then let me bring you in where we left off. We've talked about the power grid fragmenting, about abandoned cities and mutinous state lines, about how no one in Washington, D.C. is answering anymore. But let me backtrack. Let's rewind this story not to the war, but to before it. The fall didn't begin with bullets or barricades. It started with ideas. Ideas rotting in the walls. You'd have to go back at least 15 years to see the first cracks widen. Back to when political divisions stopped being performance and started becoming policy. There used to be something holding us together. Not trust. That was long gone. But inertia. A belief that even if we hated each other, the gears would keep turning. Republicans would stall spending, Democrats would rewrite tax code, presidents would sign executive orders to override both, and somewhere deep in the bureaucracy, staffers would keep typing memos. That's the lie we told ourselves. By the early 2030s, most of the agencies we relied on were either gutted or absorbed by corporate contractors. FEMA? Half its logistics went to private emergency management groups like Centricor and Black Belt. The USPS? Whittled down to interstate sorting and rural drops. Everything else routed through regional couriers. Social Security? Replaced by a patchwork of federal-state fusion programs that no one understood and everyone suspected. Then came the inflation spiral. It didn't happen overnight. No crisis ever does. In 2032, after the second East Coast hurricane in 2 years swamped Norfolk and Charleston simultaneously, federal aid was delayed, not because of lack of funds, but because FEMA had no rail contracts left. Everything had been reassigned under the Economic Response Reduction Act. That's when states started forming procurement committees without federal approval. What followed was a silent cascade of rebellion, not with guns, but with legislation. Governors stopped attending federal council meetings. DHS liaisons were refused access to state capitals. Emergency planning conferences dissolved into walkouts. And the public? Tired, furious, broke. Half the population was drowning in rent debt. Wildfires in the Rockies displaced 250,000, and the insurance companies just shrugged. They'd been reclassified under national catastrophe exemptions. Acts of God, they called it. Except this God was us. Around that time, there were signs the center was giving out. The 2033 midterms saw the lowest federal turnout in recorded history, while state-level voting surged. That year, over 40 counties across 5 states held local referendums on issues previously considered federal only. Immigration enforcement, water rights, cross-state energy trade, even small arms registry. Most of those measures passed. What shocked the Capitol wasn't that people voted, but that they stopped caring what Washington thought. Then the Eastern Pact incident hit. That's what they called it on the news. But anyone inside the Beltway knew it by its real name, the Ohio Standoff. In early 2034, a trainload of strategic medical supplies, ventilators, morphine, high-grade surgical kits was rerouted from federal stockpiles in Columbus to Pennsylvania after a political dispute between the governors. The National Guard tried to block the offload at a Cleveland rail yard. Protesters showed up. Then masked paramilitary, still unclaimed to this day, ambushed both sides. 3 state guardsmen dead. 4 civilians. 2 federal responders shot point blank. The White House called it an organized act of insurrection, but no one took the blame. No one apologized. And for the first time since the 1860s, the federal government considered invoking martial authority inside a state's borders without consent. It didn't go through. Congress was gridlocked. The vote split, not along party lines, but geographic ones. The West Coast bloc abstained. The Midwest delegation staged a walkout. The Senate floor cameras were cut mid-session, and no one ever saw the original proposal again. But people noticed. Not long after, Texas announced it would no longer enforce federal environmental codes. Colorado suspended federal firearms enforcement. And South Carolina passed a bill authorizing local militias to supplement emergency federal security gaps. Legal scholars screamed about supremacy clause violations. Governors called for unity. But by then, it didn't matter. The courts were next to fall. You don't need bullets when you've got backlog. The federal circuit system was so overwhelmed by 2035 that even basic decisions, injunctions, environmental reviews, class action lawsuit took over a year to process. In that vacuum, states began forming emergency tribunals. Technically illegal, practically necessary. You know what happens when you replace consistent law with improvised justice? You get loyalty courts, you get selective prosecution, you get silence. Whistleblowers vanished. Investigative reporters found their servers seized on national security grounds. I knew at least 4 friends' former colleagues who were arrested under something called the Media Integrity Act. No official docket, no trial date. Just a van outside their apartment at 4:00 a.m. and then gone. I tried to fight it. I submitted stories, filed FOIA requests, ran background checks on the contracts being awarded to a company named Procog Governance Systems. I thought I had something. Deep links to both major parties, international shell subsidiaries, a portfolio of software tools for public sentiment regulation. But when I started asking questions, I found my bank account frozen. My landlord evicted me. My press badge was invalidated due to record inconsistency, and suddenly no network would take my calls. So I left, packed up a U-Haul, drove south, and started building this station. With what little savings I had left, I bought 2 backup generators, a collapsible tower, and 3 pre-owned ham transceivers. I didn't set out to become a wartime broadcaster, but when your government stops calling itself a democracy and starts using terms like operational consensus zones, you start realizing it's already too late. The final nail was energy. The national grid, as we knew it, died, not with a blackout but with a disagreement. In early 2036, the Department of Energy tried to mandate coordinated load shedding during a continental heat wave. Texas refused. So did Nevada and New Mexico. Then California rerouted surplus hydroelectric into its own microgrid and shut off westbound exports. That night, parts of Arizona hit 113 degrees with no AC. People died. Lots of people. The lawsuits started immediately. But again, no court to hear them. So instead, regional power cooperatives simply stopped cooperating. They bought out local substations, rewired interconnects, declared energy sovereignty. You know what happens when you divide a grid built to be national? You get brownouts, rolling failures, infrastructure fires, and eventually a complete collapse of digital banking, food distribution, and telecom synchronization. The last time I withdrew cash from an ATM was 9 months ago. Everything since then? Barter, trade, or favors. No credit, no taxes, no receipts. And yet people still survive. Somehow. You listening right now, you know it too. You've probably seen grocery stores turned into food lockers. You've walked past decommissioned police precincts and seen the locks cut and the radios ripped out. You've seen the flags change. From state emblems to militia banners, from unity slogans to ration tables. I've got a pile of those flags here in the bunker. Not as trophies, as documentation. Because the story we're living now, the collapse of the federal union, it didn't happen because the Constitution failed. It didn't happen because we were invaded. It happened because for too long, too many people believed that no matter how bad things got, someone else would fix it. Nobody came. So now we do the fixing ourselves. Until then, if you're out there, if you're still on your feet. Tonight, we're talking about the military. What's left of it? Who's still answering orders? And who stopped pretending they had to? People like to believe the U.S. military was this monolithic things of thousands of active duty service members, all following a neat chain of command, sitting in clean bases with crisply folded flags. That's the image the old network showed you. Aircraft carriers launching off blue oceans. Special forces in desert camo. Drones overhead. Order. Discipline. Purpose. That image doesn't exist anymore. The real story? It fell apart like everything else. Slowly, then all at once. It really began with what they called the National Continuity Deployment Act in February 2036. The president issued the executive directive under Title 50, authorizing selective federal mobilization across all states deemed non-compliant with centralized logistics coordination. In normal English, that meant forced military deployments into states where federal authority had broken down. That included almost half the country. On paper, the act was a reassertion of unity. In reality, it was a last-ditch move to pretend there was still a single command structure, and almost no one followed it. The Pentagon issued orders for reserve and guard units to mobilize and reinforce supply corridors across 5 critical logistical arteries: I-10, I-40, I-80, I-95, and the Union Pacific Rail Spine from Chicago to LA. The plan was to create secure movement zones to restart commerce, protect refueling stations, and rebuild the authority of the flag. But the moment those orders went out, the cracks became visible. In Texas, the governor refused to allow National Guard assets to be federalized. Units that had trained under federal guidelines now took directives from Austin, not D.C. When an Army logistics column attempted to pass through on the way to El Paso, they were met at a checkpoint by Texas State Guard volunteers in civilian pickups armed with M14s and plate carriers. No shots fired, but the message was clear. You're not welcome here, not as occupiers. In Colorado, elements of the 10th Mountain Division were ordered to stage from Fort Carson and begin securing Highland transmission towers and microwave relays to bring communication back online. But halfway through the mobilization, a company commander received conflicting orders from NORAD Command, still semi-functional at Cheyenne Mountain, and from what appeared to be a rogue operations center using a retired FEMA channel. The unit split. Some followed through. Others turned back, calling it an unlawful command structure breach. By April, multiple brigades were ghosting orders. I mean that literally. Units stopped responding to encrypted directives. Battalion HQs weren't answering comms. Some bases, like Fort Drum and Fort Polk, simply stopped transmitting. And then came the civilian pushback. C. The National Continuity Deployment Act included one paragraph few people saw coming. Selective Civil Mobilization Clause, 40, 2B. Under this clause, citizens ages 18 to 45 in high-risk or unstable zones could be forcibly conscripted to serve in either logistical or perimeter defense operations. Conscription in the United States. In the 21st century, it wasn't sold that way, of course. Federal spokespeople called it Community Integration Service. Local mayors were told it was mandatory assistance for recovery efforts. But make no mistake, people were being taken from their homes and told they had to wear uniforms, carry weapons, and guard infrastructure, whether they agreed with the war or not. The backlash was immediate, and it didn't come from fringe radicals or militia nuts. It came from average people. Farmers, college students, teachers, people who hadn't been political until someone came to their door with a clipboard and a uniformed escort. In western Pennsylvania, local sheriffs were tasked with enforcing conscription lists. Some complied, others refused, and were fired. In Oil City, one deputy was beaten by a crowd after he attempted to detain a 19-year-old who refused to board a DHS-chartered bus headed for Fort Indiantown Gap. When National Guard troops tried to intervene, someone tossed a Molotov cocktail into their convoy truck. 3 soldiers burned. 2 of them were volunteers from out of state. That's when the armed resistance really took shape. It wasn't ideological at first. It was personal. People felt betrayed, threatened, trapped in a country that no longer cared what they wanted, only what they were obligated to do under someone else's definition of law. So when local police started showing up with lists and started confiscating firearms under the guise of temporary civil disarmament, many people fought back. In southern Missouri, entire neighborhoods organized community defense watch groups. Not radicals, families, teachers, grandparents. People who'd never fired a shot in anger, but now stood armed at the ends of gravel roads with hunting rifles and radios. They didn't call themselves militias. They didn't want to overthrow anyone. They just wanted to be left alone. But the moment they said no, the state branded them insurgents. It got worse. Former Marines and Army veterans started banding together not as outlaws, but as protectors. They began training civilians, setting up medical stations, teaching encryption protocols, maintaining diesel generators, building shortwave networks. They weren't trying to build a new country. They were trying to survive in the one that no longer recognized them. Over time, these groups gained structure. Some called themselves restoration forces. Others took regional names: High Ridge Defense, Greenbelt Volunteers, Pacific River Guard. The name didn't matter. What mattered was that they were organized, armed, and increasingly competent. And they weren't alone. Disillusioned military units began to peel off. Not all at once. Not in open rebellion. But in quiet resignation, when officers realized their orders were being rerouted through civilian agencies with unclear authority, or through non-standard communication nodes with no traceable origin, many simply stopped listening. Some transferred control to local coalitions. Others formed independent regional commands. I spoke to a former intelligence analyst out of Joint Base Lewis McChord, who told me that for 3 weeks in late May, at least 4 different command structures were issuing overlapping orders to the same units. One from a de facto presidential command node near D.C., one from a continuity of government facility in Tennessee, one from a former CENTCOM coordinator working out of an oil rig in the Gulf, and one somehow linked to a private corporation based in Northern Virginia that had never been on any public contractor list. That's how fractured things had become. Everyone thought they were the center. No one knew who was still holding the map. There are still aircraft in the sky, but most of them aren't flying under any national flag. Some are private recon drones, others retrofitted turboprops, operated by ad hoc supply chains. I've heard of at least 2 convoys being protected by ex-Air Force pilots flying old C-130s repainted with civic insignias. One of them crashed near Little Rock last week after its beacon was jammed by what might have been a leftover radar array from Redstone Arsenal. As for the nukes, that's the question everyone dances around. I don't have the answer. No one does. The nuclear triad depended on synchronized communication nodes, many of which are now offline or compromised. Submarines haven't surfaced on scheduled rotation. The Air Force bases in Montana and North Dakota that housed ICBMs? Silent for months. Some say the fail-safes are still working, that no one can launch. Others whisper that the wrong people already have the keys. All I know is, if we're still alive, it means no one's pressed the wrong button yet. We've entered a stage of history where the word military means whatever the loudest armed group in your county decides it means. And uniforms don't signify service. They signify allegiance. And remember, not every man with a rifle is a soldier. Not every badge is authority. And not every silence means surrender. In the last few broadcasts, we walked through the domestic collapse, economic fractures, civil disobedience, mutiny in the ranks, and the federal government's failure to control its own perimeter. Tonight, I want to talk about the outside world, what was left of it, the embassies that emptied, the treaties that broke in silence, the allies that no longer took our calls, and the quiet invasion that no one in this country ever voted for. Let's start with international trust, or rather, the absence of it. For decades, the United States was able to maintain global influence, not because of moral authority, but because we controlled the dollar, the information pipes, and the most powerful naval logistics network on Earth. But in the years before the collapse, all 3 began to corrode. By 2030, the global digital transaction ledger was already splintering. Countries like India, Brazil, and Indonesia started trading in regional currencies using their own blockchain protocols. The so-called Monroe Agreement, signed in Bogota, allowed 21 Latin American and Caribbean states to conduct oil and commodity transactions outside of SWIFT in the U.S. Banking shadow. That was when our financial dominance started to unravel. At the time, the American press called it a temporary geopolitical pivot. But internally, the Treasury Department saw it for what it was: the beginning of monetary isolation. Meanwhile, tensions with the European Union escalated after the 2031 cybersecurity hearings in Brussels, where leaked documents revealed that American contractors had been embedding firmware trackers in wind farm control modules shipped to Denmark, Germany, and Poland. The stated purpose was grid telemetry. The actual purpose? No one ever fully admitted it. But when your allies start replacing every device you sold them and send your diplomats home mid-term, the message is clear. Then came the failure of the Pacific Energy Pact. That agreement, signed during the height of global supply instability, was supposed to guarantee a shared emergency fuel reserve between the US, Australia, Japan, and South Korea. But when the Louisiana coastal refineries were paralyzed by the Gulf sabotage incident, still officially blamed on unknown actors, the U.S. avowals pulled all stored strategic reserves from the Pacific Ring, leaving Japan without enough LNG to power its hospitals during a record heat wave. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. Tokyo severed emergency cooperation protocols. South Korea doubled down on bilateral energy ties with China. Even Australia, long the quiet partner, began distancing itself from Washington. Within 2 years, our most reliable allies were drafting backup alliances. We weren't expelled. We were quietly forgotten. But even as our relationships abroad frayed, one neighbor remained in focus: Canada. At first, Ottawa tried to play peacemaker. During the early stages of U.S. domestic fragmentation, Canadian diplomats shuttled between D.C., state capitals, and even some of the emerging autonomous zones, trying to negotiate food aid routes, energy corridor rights, and medical coordination across the northern border. There was real hope, briefly, that the U.S. collapse might be contained through quiet Canadian diplomacy. But as usual, Washington overplayed its hand. When the northern interstate pipeline networks failed due to sabotage and copper theft in early 2034, a shortage of heating fuel in the upper Midwest sparked riots in Minneapolis, Duluth, and Fargo. The federal government responded by issuing Executive Mandate 14390, which authorized a cross-border fuel stabilization corridor, stretching from Montana through Alberta to the refineries in Edmonton and Fort McMurray. The language sounded diplomatic. The boots on the ground were anything but. Using an obscure post-NAFTA energy cooperation clause, the Department of Energy, backed by logistics teams from North River Consolidated and security units wearing U.S. Army uniforms but operating under private contract, centered Canadian territory under the guise of fuel extraction and pipeline protection. No formal treaty, no bilateral agreement. Just quiet pressure, coordinated deployment events, and a media blackout on both sides of the border. The Canadians protested, of course, but Ottawa was in no position to resist. At the time, Canada was still reeling from its own economic downturn after the failure of its pension-backed infrastructure bonds. The country was fractured, with separatist tensions in Quebec and widespread rural anger over the centralization of healthcare services. Their parliament tried to stall the Americans through procedural delays, but Washington had already set up forward operation camps outside Lethbridge and Medicine Hat. When journalists started asking questions, they were dismissed as conspiracy theorists. When one drone operator leaked footage of mobile gas flares being set up inside Saskatchewan's provincial parks, he was arrested for violating cross-border national security regulations, a charge that didn't exist in either country's legal code. That was when the Canadian provinces began to split from their own capital. Alberta, already skeptical of federal overreach, began direct negotiations with American firms, cutting out Ottawa entirely. Saskatchewan tried to resist, but was overwhelmed by domestic unrest. Manitoba declared administrative neutrality. British Columbia severed fuel exports to the U.S. in retaliation, sparking retaliatory seizures of ferry shipments in Puget Sound. In the South, American Border Patrol officers were ordered to stand down as North River units, still wearing patches that looked like federal emblems, began processing resource protection zones as extensions of American territory. No gunfire, no tanks, just ink, paper, maps redrawn with new supply routes. And the American public? Most of them never heard about it. By 2035, with most media networks collapsing under bankruptcy or seizure, the only reporting came from pirate broadcasts and international outlets, many of which were blacklisted or throttled inside the U.S. I personally interviewed a former DHS analyst who confirmed that satellite image feeds of the Alberta corridor were being filtered before public release, a selective blackout. Meanwhile, the official government position, if you could call it that, was that these were mutual resource coordination efforts. But there was nothing mutual about it. We took what we needed, because we knew we were running out of time. And the worst part? Most Americans didn't care. The cities were burning, the banks were broken, their kids were being drafted into unmarked units. So when someone said, "We've secured a northern corridor for heating fuel," people cheered. They didn't ask where it came from. But Canadians noticed. There were reports, credible ones, of Canadian border towns establishing civil watch posts along the U.S. Even now, I get messages from ham operators in Moose Jaw, in Saskatoon, in Thunder Bay. They don't trust what's happening in the South. They don't believe in our leadership anymore, assuming there's still leadership to speak of. And really, can you blame them? The United States couldn't hold its own house together, and yet it reached across the border with both hands, grabbing land and fuel and pretending it was all still under control. We didn't lose our allies. We taught them to leave. And now, for the first time in over 2 centuries, North America is no longer united by trade, trust, or treaty, but by fear, suspicion, and silence. Because in the end, it wasn't the bullets that broke the country. It was the lies. This is Thomas Avery, broadcasting once again on 7.850 megahertz. If this is reaching you, then the wires under your feet are still connected, at least for now. The antennas are still standing, the relays still sparking, and the dead frequencies haven't claimed this band yet. Tonight, I want to talk about the collapse of communication, not just the infrastructure itself, but the deeper rot, the fracture of trust, the kind that sinks into the soil and never leaves. Because before the bullets flew, and before state flags started replacing the stars and stripes on courthouse roofs, the war was already underway. It started with silence. Not the kind you hear, but the kind you feel when a screen doesn't load, when the line goes dead, when every official answer sounds scripted, when every message smells like it was drafted in a windowless room full of panic and polling numbers. Back in 2032, the United States still operated the largest digital comms framework on the planet's subsea cables, satellite constellations, backbone fiber routes, military-grade microwave towers, and thousands of redundant junction nodes. The system was designed to survive nuclear war, cyber attacks, even solar flares. But it couldn't survive mistrust. By 2033, every major media outlet had been hit by some form of disinformation. Breach deepfakes, spoofed documents, viral hoaxes, dressed up as truth. But unlike earlier decades, this wasn't just fringe memes and edited videos. These were precision-engineered manipulations, fabricated press conferences, simulated executive orders, AI-voiced presidential speeches that never happened, but were rendered in such stunning detail that half the country believed them. At first, the federal agencies fought back. The Department of Homeland Security issued something called the Digital Integrity Response Directive, or DIRD. It authorized the use of behavioral analytics, platform monitoring, and AI filters on every U.S.-based platform to detect and suppress misinformation. A noble goal, until it wasn't. The filters worked too well. Within a month, people were finding their messages buried. Videos disappeared. Search results redirected to corrective content. Entire discussion threads went dark, mid-conversation. There were reports that private encrypted group chats, Signal, Element, even isolated forums, hosted on meshnet servers, were suddenly crashing or being auto-flagged for instability rhetoric. It didn't matter if the content was false or not. It only mattered if someone thought it might be dangerous. And once you start policing thoughts, you stop hearing voices. The backlash came from all sides. The left screamed about surveillance. The right screamed about censorship. The center stopped listening altogether. Trust in federal digital messaging collapsed. Polls showed less than 14% of Americans believed anything issued through official emergency notification channels. Then came the Emergency Stability Declaration, March 9, 2034. a joint statement from the White House and what remained of the Federal Communications Commission. The country was placed under Tier 3 emergency continuity protocols, authorizing immediate shutdown or containment of any infrastructure deemed a risk to public order, including independent broadcasting towers, satellite uplink ISPs, and amateur relay networks. In layman's terms, they tried to turn off the internet. Not all at once. Not like some cartoon switch in a bunker. It was subtler than that. Regional DNS servers were overwritten with new routing protocols. BGP routes were modified to isolate certain metro areas. Peering agreements with backbone providers were suspended under national emergency clauses. And in the background, physical choke points data centers, exchanges, cloud relay hubs were placed under federal oversight, often staffed by military contracted specialists with no visible agency affiliation. But here's the thing about networks. They don't die clean. They fray. As federal authorities tried to cut cables and block exits, entire alternative systems bloomed beneath the surface. In parts of Vermont and New Hampshire, off-grid communities began stringing together micro-relay towers using old Wi-Fi routers flashed with long-range firmware, bouncing signal over hills using solar and battery-powered rigs. In Austin, Texas, students and tech workers activated dormant IPv6 testbeds and built a citywide meshnet that fed into satellite uplinks no one knew still existed. And in parts of the Appalachians, a group of former AT&T linemen working with ham radio operators restored half of a dormant copper grid abandoned after the fiber switch. They began broadcasting encrypted news packets twice a day old school through 56 modems and converted broadcast headers. It wasn't fast, but it worked. Even as the official networks failed, the underground bloomed. Still, the feds tried to fight it. Operation Signal Purity launched in July of that year, an effort to locate and neutralize rogue communications clusters using mobile signal triangulation. The plan? Send drones into suspected broadcast zones, locate antennas, and send in containment teams to dismantle the equipment and detain the operators. I know this because I was nearly one of them. In late July, a week after I started my first test transmission from this site, I picked up a low-frequency buzz that didn't belong to any local interference. It was a roaming signal, marker pinging every 12 seconds, designed to provoke a reply. A bait frequency. If you responded, they locked on. You had maybe 10 minutes to kill your rig and vanish. I didn't reply, but someone else did 30 miles southeast. A tiny broadcaster working out of the remains of a high school tech lab. She transmitted news, weather, even old music. Harmless stuff. I heard the rotor blades overhead that night. By morning, her signal was gone. And this is where things turned darker. The people had already stopped trusting federal news. But now, they stopped trusting each other. No one knew who was transmitting truth or manipulation. One week, a signal from Denver warned of food seizures by federal marshals only, for it to be revealed as a psychological ops campaign seeded by a rogue faction of the old DHS. Another week, a video claiming to show constitutional judges being detained was shared across 3 states until the footage was proven to be years old, re-rendered with new faces. It didn't matter. By the time truth caught up, the damage was already done. Trust had been weaponized. People began smashing radio towers, afraid they were feeding enemy maps. Amateur broadcasters were accused of destabilization. In one town outside Des Moines, a ham operator was lynched after a storm rumor spread, claiming he was using his station to coordinate looting raids. The rumor was false, but again, facts no longer mattered. Only the signal. Meanwhile, the White House had gone silent. Official statements became sterile. Looped announcements pre-recorded by synthetic voices. Even televised emergency addresses appeared more and more staged. Disconnected, distant. The president, whoever was still holding that title, hadn't appeared live on camera in weeks. Then came the signal ghost incidents. Multiple independent operators reported picking up government-style broadcasts that included dead channel music, off-hour coded sequences, and eerie placeholder transmissions, test tones, half-spoken weather updates, and 5-digit number codes that looped for hours. No identification, no agency tags, just strange, empty noise. One of them kept repeating the same phrase, distorted by modulation drift. Continuity, confirmed. Integrity, in progress. Truth, withheld. No one ever figured out where it came from. The battlefield had shifted, not to borders, not even to cities, but to minds. People began digging in not just physically, but ideologically. If your neighbor said something that sounded too polished, you assumed he worked for someone. If a community member quoted old federal doctrine, people whispered he might be a signal man, the nickname given to suspected federal propagandists. Families split. Towns banned radios. Information became smuggled, like contraband. And amid all of it, the government's real power disappeared not with a bang, but a stutter. Because when people no longer trust the words, they stop listening altogether. And when they stop listening, it doesn't matter how many satellites you control. Your voice is gone. This is Thomas Avery, broadcasting once again across whatever gaps remain in this wounded country's atmosphere. 7.850 megahertz. If you're hearing this, the band is still alive. And if the band is alive, so are we. For now. The last time we spoke, I walked you through how the comms broke just the satellites and fiber, but the trust, how the signals died, and the truth with it. But tonight we go deeper. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about what's happening in the places where nothing gets out anymore. Where power exists in name only. Where city halls are bunkers and airports are no-fly zones. Where rumors travel faster than planes because planes aren't flying anymore. Let's start with the cities. You might think of a city as a government, a mayor, a council, some police, maybe a National Guard unit posted nearby. But when the federal structure collapsed and states began refusing mutual aid protocols, cities turned on themselves. Every metropolitan zone was different, but the script, in broad strokes, was the same. Atlanta. Fulton County tried to declare itself a neutral civilian governance district after the Georgia State Assembly effectively stopped meeting in person and relocated to Macon. The Atlanta Metro Police Chief refused to cooperate, citing constitutional obligations to the state. Within days, the county courthouse was barricaded, and rival factions of police began patrolling different districts of the city. Peachtree Street checkpoints were manned by opposing uniformed groups on side flying the old city flag, the other under emergency Georgia Homeland Security colors. Martial law was unofficial, but the street battles weren't. Multiple firefights were caught on private drone feeds, though most of those accounts are gone now. Hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties, not from gangs, but from conflicting police units engaging each other in South Atlanta, East Point, and Vine City. The Atlanta airport Hartsfield-Jackson was shut down after someone launched a shoulder-fired rocket at a C-27 military cargo plane during descent. The aircraft was carrying emergency medical equipment bound for Grady. Nobody ever claimed responsibility, but after that, the nationwide civilian airspace ban was enforced. Technically, it was called a Temporary National Aviation Stabilization Protocol, but it functioned as a no-fly directive for all civilian aircraft not pre-registered with one of the 6 surviving regional aviation coordinators. Private pilots, grounded, commercial aircraft, parked, tourists, business travelers, migrants all stranded. By then, airline infrastructure was in shambles anyway. Most of the big airlines had either collapsed into bankruptcy or been absorbed into ad hoc logistics groups backed by state interests. But the real problem came from the airports themselves. As cities fragmented, airports became flashpoints. Why? Because airports are gateways, strategic corridors, and the moment control was lost over who enters and who leaves, the city became ungovernable. In Denver, the municipal government tried to maintain airport security through contracted personnel. But when the Colorado Continuity Authority, a rogue state-aligned body, declared that Denver International was to be secured by constitutional defense volunteers. Chaos erupted. Over 3 nights, civilian passengers trapped in terminals were forcibly removed. Some were relocated to state shelters. Others, those who resisted, simply vanished. No records, no luggage, no answers. By the time the power was cut, an estimated 1,400 people were unaccounted for from DIA alone. The entire complex was sealed off with earth movers and portable barricades. Today, the control tower still flashes an idle beacon, but no one's seen a working runway crew in months. In Philadelphia, the city fractured not by outside invasion but by internal division. The mayor attempted to invoke emergency regionalism, offering safe haven to nearby townships. In return, they would provide food, fuel, and security. But the local unions refuse power. Transit refused the deal. They accuse the administration of operating under undisclosed federal mandates. Within 48 hours, union-aligned militias seized sections of South Philly and the Delaware waterfront. Council members were placed under protective custody. City Hall became a fortress. And across the Schuylkill, rival factions controlling the Navy Yard began issuing their own curfews. What followed was urban trench warfare, fought block by block. Police were no longer enforcing law. They were enforcing loyalty. And civilians, they picked sides or were crushed between them. In the suburbs, vigilante groups emerged first as neighborhood watches, then as enforcers. They patrolled cul-de-sacs with modified pickup trucks, homemade barricades, radio repeaters, and retooled garden sprayers filled with fuel-based deterrents. They weren't crazy. They were desperate. They didn't trust the city, didn't trust the state, didn't even trust their own neighbors half the time. In many cities, vigilante justice replaced due process entirely. In Portland, the collapse of the power grid meant the jail system failed locks deactivated. Staff walked off the job. When a series of violent assaults broke out downtown, a community tribunal was formed in a defunct fire station. Trials were held in the back garage. No lawyers, just accusations and outcomes. Most ended with exile. Some didn't. People vanished. And the scary part? The public accepted it. Because they preferred vigilante certainty over judicial bureaucracy that no longer existed. By late 2035, entire swaths of the country became known as blackout zones. Not because the lights went out, but because information stopped. Places where no comms came in, no comms went out. Just silence. Detroit, one of the first major blackout zones. After the collapse of state oversight and the federal freeze on industrial shipping, local unions took over city management. At first it worked. Water flowed, trash was collected, power stayed on. But when internal factionalism erupted between transit, sanitation, and emergency services, the whole system buckled. There were reports, credible ones, of an internal coup within the Detroit Civic Continuity Council. The old police precincts were fortified. Bus depots became armories. Local media feeds cut out entirely. The last known signal was a broadband radio distress beacon that repeated one phrase: "Do not enter without clearance." Perimeter security active. Long live the council. No one's heard anything since. Satellite imaging shows power still active in downtown. But no vehicle traffic, no comms, just eerie stillness. Seattle became a blackout zone after the regional governor attempted to seize control of the Port of Tacoma's remaining fuel reserves. The National Guard refused the order. Instead, a coalition of port workers, private security contractors, and volunteer fire crews staged a counteraction. Downtown was barricaded. Interstate 5 was mined. The city split into grid zones with independent oversight. One by one, all digital feeds were severed intentionally. The message was clear: Seattle governs itself. No outside authority recognized. When a group of embedded journalists from Spokane tried to enter through the Highway 18 corridor, they were turned away by a checkpoint using surplus Canadian armor and modified heat sensors. Someone inside had foreign equipment. That much we know. But no one knows who's in charge now. No signals. No leaks. No refugees. The city might as well be the moon. And here's the terrifying truth. No one is coming to save them. Because there's no one left with the authority to say who needs saving. The blackout zones are spreading. New Orleans, Salt Lake City, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Sacramento, all showing signs of internal isolation. No transponder traffic, no confirmed drone images, no outbound broadcasts. Just rumors. Rumors of mass displacements, of rogue military units setting up fiefdoms, of survivors forced into labor to maintain microgrids, of cities where the lights still glow but no one knows who turned them on. And maybe worst of all, there are whispers that some of these zones are functioning. Efficient, organized, silent by design. Because silence, in this new America, means control. This is Thomas Avery, broadcasting liver, as close to it as you can get now, from what used to be the Heartland, 7.850 megahertz. A relic frequency in a fractured country. You're listening to this transmission because we still believe voices matter, that records matter, that even in collapse, history must be remembered. Tonight, I want to tell you about what happened to the southern borderland, what crawled through it while we were too busy collapsing to notice. But first, let's rewind. When the government broke apart, cartels didn't just fill the vacuum, they expanded into it with terrifying precision. They had the structure, the money, the discipline, and, most importantly, the intelligence networks. While DC politicians bickered over constitutional succession, cartel strategists were building cross-border infrastructure. Not just tunnels and convoys governance. Sinaloa, Jalisco New Generation, Los Zetas splinters, they all moved fast. Faster than our own fractured law enforcement could react. And surprisingly, it wasn't just to flood the U.S. with drugs. That was already happening. What changed after the collapse was mission. These syndicates began repositioning themselves as protection forces. In towns where state police were gone, where National Guard units looted more than they protected, people turned to whoever kept the lights on and the violence away. And in many places, that was the cartels. Let me be clear. They weren't Robin Hood. They taxed. They punished. But they also defended. In South Texas, near McAllen and Harlingen, communities aligned themselves with cartel liaisons, men in tactical gear with better discipline than what remained of the regional police. They ran checkpoints, distributed propane, secured water towers. In return, they controlled the routes. And if the federal military tried to come back, those units were met with ambushes, so coordinated it was clear they had inside intel. Some people called it treason. Others called it stability. The U.S.-Mexico border, once a politically charged debate topic, had become something far more chaotic, a moving front. Not a line, but a zone spanning dozens of miles north and south, governed by shifting pacts and unspoken ceasefires. In El Paso, after the collapse of Joint Task Force North, cartels seized the supply depots left behind at Fort Bliss. Some military vehicles, unconfirmed reports, suggest 24 were repainted and integrated into security convoys, crossing the border under cartel protection. When questioned, locals described them not as threats, but as enforcers of calm. They didn't wear flags. They wore tactical rigs and headset sand. They responded to trouble faster than the city's last functioning police department, which had fewer than 30 officers remaining. In Tucson, rival gangs from Los Angeles, Phoenix, and even Salt Lake descended like scavengers, trying to stake their claim on trade routes and depots. But the chaos didn't last. Within weeks, an alliance had formed small-time gangs, dissolving into a new power structure. The Border Alliance Collective. Not a cartel. Not exactly. More like a loosely affiliated command structure, a coalition of armed groups that agreed to share resources, rotate patrols, and enforce justice their version of it. They executed looters, protected farmers, even hosted elections in 2 town smock ballots where residents could vote for who managed border crossings and food ration centers. Was it law? No. Was it order? In a way. It was better than being ruled by corrupt out-of-state militias or federal leftovers who acted like occupiers. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy was unraveling in slow motion. You'd think, of all the armed branches, the Navy would be the hardest to fracture. Ships offshore, disconnected from the land chaos. But naval command relies on central coordination. Fleet movement, replenishment, air cover all gone. And that left vessels vulnerable. In San Diego, as the last West Coast replenishment command fell silent, the crew of the USS John Finna, destroyer abandoned ship, after going 64 hours without orders or resupply. What happened next is still being verified, but according to sources in the Pacific Emergency Coastal Authority, a group of private contractors commandeered the ship, raised a non-U.S. flag, and sailed into open waters with radar disabled. Some believe the ship was taken to a converted shipping port in Ensenada, now controlled by foreign-backed maritime forces. But it wasn't just naval vessels. Submarine Asius. Submarines were seized during port chaos. The USS Maryland, a ballistic missile sub, had already offloaded most of its payload months earlier. But during a failed port rotation in Kings Bay, Georgia, rogue elements of its security detail mutinied. The crew tried to hold the vessel, but someone had inside access to dry dock controls. The sub was taken out of commission before it could leave the harbor. Satellite images show it resting submerged in the shallows. Who controls it now? No one knows. And then, the real terror began. I'm not talking about vigilante mobs or cartel checkpoints. I'm talking about terrorists, foreign operatives, extremists, and opportunists. In the spring of 2036, just as the country was focused on fighting itself, multiple coordinated bombings hit military airports across the country. Joint Base Andrew Skrippled. Barksdale AFB entire runway destroyed. Scott AFB in Illinois hit by a fuel-air explosive device. Explosions were precise, simultaneous, and devastating. The attacks weren't claimed. No organization stepped forward. But chatter on foreign channels hinted at coordinated operations launched by non-state actors, most likely backed by entities outside the country who saw our collapse as an invitation. There's credible speculation based on SIGINT intercepts that the bombing operations were coordinated via indirect relay chains through shuttered embassies and expatriate militias. Some of these groups had been training for years, waiting for the exact moment the U.S. wouldn't be able to retaliate. That moment came. And they didn't just target airports. In Florida, a weapons storage facility near Eglin was breached not by locals, but by an external team with encrypted comms and unfamiliar tactics. Surveillance was blind, power was out, response time, too slow. Within hours, a cache of anti-aircraft munitions and drone interceptors was gone. 1 week later, a U.S. cargo transport trying to deliver medical supplies to northern Alabama was downed by a man-portable air defense system. The wreckage was picked clean before even the closest responder could arrive. Our skies became unsafe, not just grounded hunted. And all of this, the gangs, the seizures, the sabotage fed a greater truth. The world had moved on. America was no longer feared, just divided, and therefore exploitable. At the United Nations, what remains of Itor's seat sits empty. No ambassador, no delegation. Just a dusty placard beside nations who now negotiate around us instead of with us. Back home, we don't even know what was lost. No central inventory. No secure comms. No cohesive response. The Southern Defense Ring, once a classified network of sensor stations and coastal radar installations, is now silent. Some of the hardware may have been scavenged, some sold, some simply lost to time. As I speak now, The Gulf is no longer ours. Not entirely. Rumors swirl of a foreign-backed platform off the Louisiana coast once. A deep-water drilling rig, now armed, patrolled, and dark, to all standard transponder queries. And on the border, we have cartels enforcing curfews more effectively than local governments. Gangs flying handmade flags. Civilians learning that protection may come from men with blood on their hands because the people in uniforms left and never came back. Tonight, I want to talk about the people and the entities that moved in when the system collapsed. Not the military. Not the states. I'm talking about the private kings. The wealthy. The powerful. The companies that once claimed they had no flags, no borders, no allegiance. Until the day came when flags meant nothing and borders could be bought. Let's start at the top. By the time the federal government fractured beyond recovery, most Fortune 500 companies had already shifted contingency assets offshore. Not just money, but leadership, infrastructure, and mobility plans. You don't become a trillion-dollar tech firm without knowing how to survive a geopolitical implosion. Take Novatech Systems, formerly headquartered in Chicago. By 2032, they had already constructed what they called resilience hubs in Geneva, Osaka, and a converted offshore platform near the Canary Islands. These weren't just data centers. They were full-fledged, company-operated micronations, complete with private airstrips, drone patrols, desalination plants, and hardened underground vaults, housing both data and executives. So when Chicago fell into rolling unrest, and the Illinois Continuity Authority lost jurisdiction, Novatech did not wait. They airlifted all Tier 1 staff to Europe within 72 hours, using private cargo jets escorted by contracted aerial security. Their departure was so precise, the city barely noticed until the lights in the loop stopped responding to grid resets. Novatech wasn't alone. Caldwell Krieger, the defense technology conglomerate with major holdings in Denver, Los Angeles, and Tampa, initiated a full perimeter lockdown of their Tampa coastal complex. When federal troops stationed nearby attempted to requisition the site as part of a strategic asset seizure, Caldwell, Krieger's on-site security, backed by its in-house paramilitary unit, refused access and issued a sovereign facilities declaration. That phrase, sovereign facilities, is now the legal fiction that dozens of megacorporations use to justify de facto control of entire city sectors. In Austin, the old Caldwell Krieger R&D campus expanded into a fully militarized zone, complete with concrete blast gates, biometric border crossings, anti-drone countermeasures, and perimeter patrols using autonomous surveillance dogs armed with subsonic taser pods. They claimed it was for internal corporate safety, but no one enters without biometric clearance. Inside, the company houses employees, families, and approved contractors. Food and power are produced on site. Water is pumped from sealed wells. Laws are internal. Currency is proprietary. To the outside world, it's just another fenced compound. To those inside, it's the only law that works. Similar developments happened in Salt Lake City, where the former HQ of Ethereum Logistics, once the nation's third largest automated freight, broke revolved into a walled city. Their security arm, AL Solutions, is now rumored to field over 4,000 armed personnel across 5 states. Many wear rebranded uniforms, but they're all private, all paid, and all loyal to a paycheck, not a constitution. The shift wasn't always military. Some corporations chose strategic relocation. When the dollar began to fail and cross-border trade collapsed, Mile Deep Media, one of the last functioning global streaming platforms, offered a unique solution to its top 5 subscribers: exit packages. If you had the right subscriber tier, they offered you passage through chartered vessels, secured ground convoys, or transatlantic air route testo safe hold communities in Norway, Estonia, or New Zealand. They even offered repatriation of digital assets through hard drive wallets and human capital passports, a euphemism for paid migration. Tens of thousands took the offer. They left the country. Some abandoned homes, some took families. They never looked back. But for the rest of us, the ones who didn't have clearance, codes, or capital we, were left in a corporate wasteland. That's where the kings without crowns rose. People like Victor Lang, former CFO of Ascendant Capital, who took control of Westport, Connecticut, using an inherited security detail and a stockpile of gold-backed digital currency hosted on isolated servers. He purchased local law enforcement outright, replaced city council with appointed trustees, and turned Westport into a fortified town of vetted residence property owners only, subject to quarterly community contribution assessments in exchange for full protection and resource access. Or Emmeline Torrance, who once managed regional logistics for Inland Foods and now operates the Kansas Free Trade Belta network of grain silos, drone convoys, and controlled irrigation zones, extending across 3 counties. She issues her own currency, hosts arbitration courts inside decommissioned Walmart buildings, and employs former farmers as both laborers and armed guards. She doesn't call herself a governor. She calls herself an allocator. And in her world, that means God. But while the giants fortified, the small businesses, the lifeblood of local America, were obliterated. The first to go were the independents who relied on cross-state distribution. Mom-and-pop grocers, boutique mechanics, family-owned pharmacies. Take Hurley's Tools, a 90-year-old hardware store in Dayton, Ohio. They had 3 generations of loyal customers and regional contracts with 3 school districts. When supply lanes broke down, they tried to pivot to barter offering gear for diesel, copper wire, even ammo. But then a convoy from the new regional militia seized their inventory under emergency requisition. Hurley's didn't have the leverage or the firepower. They were closed within a week. Corner Bean Cafe in Asheville tried to adapt, offering warm food to displaced families, hosting a community radio node, even securing small generator power through co-op contributions. But when a private security firm associated with an out-of-state grocery chain purchased the surrounding block, they were evicted. The cafe was converted into a contract-only food voucher station, accessible by registered pass only. Keller Print. Signs in Wichita gone. Not because of looters, but because there was no more economy for signs. No one needed event banners, wedding invites, or campaign posters. There were no events, no weddings, and certainly no campaigns. The supply chain collapsed downward, crushing those at the bottom first. Then, as corporate interests hardened into local governments, only 2 types of business survived. 1. Those with private protection contracts, and 2. Those who agreed to internal corporate integration. In other words, if you didn't sell out or buy in, you vanished. Even regional chainsaw stable, Familiar Air, mostly extinct. Gibson's Auto, once operating in 11 Midwest states, has only 2 remaining locations owned in Topeka, where the mayor's brother converted the garage into an armored vehicle depot, and 1 in Lincoln, where the remaining store serves as a checkpoint for militia-controlled fuel swaps. These places didn't just go bankrupt. They were erased from the fabric of daily life. And with them went the idea that anyone, anywhere, still owns their life, unless someone more powerful allows it. This is what the collapse really looks like. Not fire, not screaming crowds, but a man locking his shop for the last time, not because he failed, but because the rules changed. And now, those who wrote the new rules wear no uniforms. They don't sit in Capitol buildings. They sit in glass towers with private helipads, behind 6 layers of biometric clearance, deciding who gets water, who gets heat, and who gets remembered. This is Thomas Avery, still broadcasting from Kentucky soil, still sending out signal across the broken spectrum on 7.850 megahertz. If you're listening to this, you've chosen to remain aware, to care, even now. And maybe, like the people I'm going to tell you about tonight, You've chosen something harder than fighting or fleeing. You chose to stay. See, after the system fell apart, after the states fractured, the corporations closed their doors. The military turned in on itself. Most of the attention, mine included, went to the big stories. The soldiers who turned rogue, the governors who declared independence, the CEOs who built city walls and printed their own currencies. But out there, between the fortified cities and the blackout zones, between the abandoned interstates and the weaponized supply routes, there's another America still breathing. Not surviving through guns or power, but through persistence. Let me tell you about the Harpers. In the southern edge of Missouri, just outside West Plains, the Harper family had run a small nursery business for 32 years. Greenhouses, local delivery, seasonal produce sold from a roadside stand with a tin roof and a hand-painted sign. When the banks froze and the first wave of convoys stopped coming, they didn't panic. They converted one of their 2 greenhouses into a self-contained aquaponics loop using trout, rainwater, and salvaged fertilizer. No YouTube tutorials, no NGO assistance. Just old notebooks from agricultural extension courses and a radio connection with a retired university professor 2 towns over. They used solar panels, salvaged from abandoned rest stops, wired into a lithium bank stripped out of 3 totaled hybrid vehicles. The wiring was ugly, dangerous even, but it worked. They kept a portion of their produce for the family and bartered the rest. Tomatoes for antibiotics, lettuce for propane, trout fillets for fuel filters. No one appointed them leaders. They didn't seek power. But every Sunday, the field behind their nursery hosted a quiet market. By month 6, more than 40 families were trading there in no flags. No checkpoints, just handshakes and mutual need. Not far from them, in rural Virginia, there's a woman named Rhonda Claiborne. She was a high school English teacher before the collapse. Lived alone after her husband passed. When the school district shut down, she opened her doors to the neighborhood kids. Not for lessons at first, just a safe place to sit, eat, and talk while their parents tried to barter work or fix fences. But soon, she began teaching again. No whiteboards, no report cards, just stories. Shared aloud, copied by hand, passed around and cherished. She began collecting whatever books remained, from church basements, from abandoned school storage, from mailboxes where librarians had hidden them, not knowing if they'd ever be checked out again. Within a year, her little house had become something unthinkable in this new world. A library. Kids came to her yard every morning, rain or shine. They sat on milk crates. They listened. They took books home and brought them back. She taught them to write in ink again, to spell, to remember. In a world collapsing into muscle and violence, she rebuilt language. And then there's the Alvarez brothers. 3 siblings, mid-30s, living in what used to be suburban New Mexico. Their parents had passed before the collapse. The neighborhood emptied out. First it was looters, then armed patrols, then nothing. Just quiet, broken houses, and dry wind. But they stayed. They rebuilt the irrigation system along their block using parts pulled from air conditioning units and PVC pipes. They redirected rainwater through gravel filters and into underground drums insulated with scrap insulation. They built passive coolers from clay and shade, designed to keep produce viable for 5 or 6 days without electricity. And when they started growing again squash, beans, corn, they didn't hoard it. They put a sign out front. Take what you need, leave what you can. People came. Sometimes they stole everything. But the brothers rebuilt the next day anyway. Eventually, word spread. And one morning they found the bins full before they even opened them. Neighbors had begun leaving offerings at dawn. Eggs, soap, wrenches. One day, someone left a child's drawing of the garden, taped to the side of the bin with dried honey. They don't call it a commune. They don't need to. It just became home again. Not everyone stayed for noble reasons. Some stayed because they couldn't leave. The sick, the elderly, the disabled, people left behind by fuel shortages, or caretakers who vanished, or simply by fear. Like James Holloway, an amputee living in Boise. He'd lost his right leg in an old factory accident and used a motorized chair salvaged from a hardware store. The first year, he almost died 3 times. No one came when the water main failed. No one answered when he radioed for help. But the boy across the street, Benji, 12 years old, began checking in. First, it was just a cup of rice, then battery swaps. Eventually, the kid rigged a solar charging panel to James's garage roof and wired it to a trickle charger to keep the chair functional. He figured out how to bypass the battery lockout using instructions from a physics book written 30 years ago. That boy and that man survived together, not through heroism, but through presence. And what they represent is something we rarely talk about anymore. Because in all the war reports, and militia movements, and supply chain seizures, we forget that humans don't just survive with force. They survive with each other. There are thousands of these stories, maybe millions. Tiny efforts, small gardens, rooftop beehives, old churches turned into first aid posts, gas stations that became message boards where survivors leave notes, real paper notes for missing relatives. In parts of Wisconsin, neighbors have begun laying down stones in front of homes to indicate conditions inside. A flat circle means sick. A triangle means armed. A handprint in ash means help needed. It's not government. It's not militia code. It's just a local system. A way to say, we're still here. And across dozens of counties in the Midwest, community bands are making a quiet return, not music, but bands of trust. Groups who agree to protect the roads, to monitor weather, to warn of outsiders, not with violence, but with cooperation. These people don't have fuel convoys. They don't have armored patrols. But they have roots. And roots, when left alone long enough, grow into forests. In one corner of West Virginia, there's a town that still runs by candlelight. They don't allow outsiders in after dark. They don't trade fuel. But every child under the age of 15 gets an education. They've rebuilt 3 wood stoves from salvaged parts and figured out how to store cold creek water using canvas, sacks, and limestone. No internet, no radio. But they've painted murals on the walls of every burned-out building. Scenes of what the town once looked like and what they hope it might become again. They have no army, no government, no plan to grow big or powerful. They just live. And in this shattered country, living without power or cruelty is the most rebellious act of all. This is Thomas Avery, signing in once more 7.850 megahertz, broadcasting from the edge of memory and the last edge of reason. If you're hearing this, the antenna's still standing. The generator hasn't given out. And somewhere, maybe far from here, maybe not, a human being still turns a dial and listens. I began this broadcast series 3 years ago. 3 years, 2 months, and 6 days after the first boots marched on American soil under conflicting flags. It has been 5 years since the start of what history books, should they ever return, will call the Second American Civil War. 5 years since uniformed men fired on each other outside Fort Wayne, not knowing if the other side was still loyal or just tired. 5 years since governors turned their backs on federal orders, since water was rerouted by force, and the Constitution became less a document and more a question. And the war? It still goes on. There's no treaty, no table, no map. Just fighting, fading, forgetting, an endless struggle between jurisdictions that no longer exist, and armies that no longer serve a country, only themselves, or what remains of their convictions. Some fronts are quiet now. Others rage louder than ever. But the worst of it, what haunts me even more than the collapse itself, is that the last real hope for unity was not taken by force. It died in silence. Let me tell you about New Columbia. That was the name given to the provisional government formed in the 3rd year of the conflict. Not in D.C., that city had long become a walled capital of ghosts. No. The attempt came from Kansas City, in a region considered neutral at the time by both federal loyalists and secessionist blocs. New Columbia was supposed to be the Phoenix, a coalition of surviving federal staffers, regional administrators, former senators, even a handful of corporate policy advisors. They gathered inside a heavily fortified Marriott Conference Center, still running on tri-fuel backup. Behind closed doors, surrounded by layers of security contracted from private firms and surviving National Guard elements, they wrote what they called the Second Unity Charter. The idea was bold, almost noble. A power-sharing agreement between states, rotating regional capitals, a new civilian military council with limited executive authority. They even invited independent militias to send non-voting observers. It wasn't the old United States. It was something leaner, stripped down, compromised. But it had structure. It had signatures. It had flags. A new flag. 3 stripes. A circle of 13 stars, each representing a surviving regional command that had agreed tentatively to recognition. They sent out messengers, radio broadcasts, supply drops. They printed and physically delivered charter copies. They called for a national ceasefire, a day of silence, a single day without shots fired, where all sides were asked to lay down arms 7 just for 24 hours and listen. Some regions honored it. Others mocked it. One eastern militia broadcast footage of themselves burning the new flag while laughing into the camera. A border governor called it a child's fantasy written in the bones of a burned nation. No major factions joined. No real concessions were made. And within weeks, 2 of the 13 signatory nodes went dark. The Unity Council attempted one final gesture, a national summit. Delegates were invited from across the country, armed escorts guaranteed. But only 8 showed up, and one of them brought a bodyguard who opened fire during the second hour of proceedings, killing 4 people before being subdued. After that, the summit dissolved. The council retreated behind their walls. No broadcasts were sent for weeks. I tried to reach them. Nothing. A month later, Kansas City went silent. Satellite imaging showed smoke rising from the convention center. No one knows who attacked. Some say it was internal sabotage. Others claim it was an external raid, a statement from a rising cartel force in Oklahoma or a rogue corporate task unit. But no one took credit, and no response ever came. New Columbia died without even making the news. The last serious attempt to bring the country back under one banner ended not with fire or betrayal, but with neglect. And that's the hardest part to accept, because we all thought deep down that someone would fix this, that after enough suffering, enough chaos, someone would rise up and pull the pieces back together. That there'd be a Lincoln, a Washington, a unifying voice with enough weight, enough vision to bind the fragments. But we forgot something. The founders didn't rise in darkness. They rose in sunlight, with communities behind them, with ink and parchment and time. We had none of that. We had fatigue, division, fear, and silence. And now, years later, this is what remains. Scattered zones with improvised laws, corridors controlled by privatized enforcers, checkpoints not governed by national mandate, but by whoever held the strongest claim at dusk. Children who don't remember federal holidays, maps that change every month, and broadcasts like this straining through rusted coils, hoping to stitch memory back together. So where does that leave us? Let me leave you with a story. It's not about America. Not directly. It's about Rome. At the end of the Western Roman Empire, as cities fell and legions disbanded, there were still places, little towns, isolated farms, scattered monasteries where people continued to live. They taught their children Latin. They copied texts by hand. They farmed. They prayed. They spoke of law and duty and truth. Not because the empire still ruled, but because the memory of the empire still mattered. And from those places, those quiet places, came the foundation of something else. Not the empire reborn, but a civilization that could grow from the ashes. So if you're still listening, if you've chosen not to kneel to power, not to flee into shadows, not to fire at your neighbor, but to plant, to read, to raise children, to speak truth, even if no one answers, then you are more powerful than the kings with guns, more dangerous than the traitors with walls, and more American than the flags we burned. This is Thomas Avery, 5 years into the war that never needed to be, still transmitting, still remembering. And if one day someone finds this voice in the static, know that we were here, and we tried.